lecture, we'll be talking about one of the most commonest female reproductive health issues, PCOS, Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome. Now, poly to mean that's many, cystic from the word cysts. So there are many cysts. Then ovarian, that's our target gland. So the condition actually occurs in the ovary. So meaning that there are a lot of cysts in the ovary. Then syndrome meaning that once you have PCOS, you're also at risk of getting other conditions like even diabetes, infertility issues. So before I continue, let's do a short diagrammatic expression of the HPO axis. So hypothalamus, pituitary gland, and then the ovary. This is just a diagrammatic representation of the HPO axis. Now, the hypothalamus is a small organ in the brain that helps to regulate a number of functions. One includes temperature. But in this condition, we will look at the hormonal function of hypothalamus. Now, the hypothalamus is responsible for the production of or the release of the gonadotropin releasing hormone. And then this hormone acts on the pituitary gland, specifically the anterior pituitary gland, to produce FSH and then LH. Now, FSH means the follicle stimulating hormone, and then the H means the follicle stimulate the luteinizing hormone. And then lastly, we look at the ovaries, where these hormones act to produce or give us the various physiological processes. Now, before we continue, let's look at the small characteristics of these hormones, the FSH and then the LH. So the FSH, it is the main dominant female hormone. 2, it is responsible for follicle or egg development. 3, it is responsible for estrogen production. And finally, high estrogen levels inhibit release. So vice versa, low estrogen levels will increase its release. Then let's see LH, that's the luteinizing hormone. It is the main dominant hormone in the male. It is responsible for matured follicle or egg, for that matter, release. It is responsible for testosterone production. It also stimulates steroid production. And finally, high estrogen levels have positive feedback on its production or release. Now, these features are going to help us understand the PCOS condition. Now, one major risk factor for PCOS is obesity. Now, obesity is a condition where you have a lot of fats or cholesterol stored under your skin. And then for people who are obese, usually their BMI is greater than 30. Now, what happens is that Your fat cells are also able to produce estrogens. So for someone who has obesity, we are expecting that the fat cells will generate quite a lot of estrogens. And we have said that high estrogen levels inhibit the release of FSH. So once an obese person is producing a lot of estrogen from the fat cells, we are expecting these levels of estrogen to inhibit the release of FSH. Now, for you to be able to understand the role of these hormones in PCOS, you may have to visit my video on the menstrual cycle, where you understand the actual roles of FSH and then LH. But briefly, FSH is responsible for follicle or egg development. So once a female is done menstruating, or probably in the state of menstruating, new follicles are being developed. And the hormone responsible for their development is FSH. So this hormone helps these follicles to develop to a certain stage or point. And then the luteinizing hormone also takes it from there. As we saw, that the luteinizing hormone is responsible for matured follicle or egg release. So in one phase, the follicle stimulating hormone helps the follicles to develop. And then in another phase, the luteinizing hormone helps the final egg to be released. So once a person who has PCOS has a lot of estrogen produced from the fat cells, we expect this FSH production to be low, meaning that follicles cannot be developed. In another way, whatever stage they have gotten to, they remain there because the follicle stimulating hormone is not present. So we have something we call the FSH luteinizing hormone. This ratio becomes less than 1 in people with PCOS because their FSH levels are low and they have higher levels of luteinizing hormone. Like we said, high estrogen levels have a positive feedback on its production or luteinizing hormone release. So the higher concentration of estrogen produced from these fat cells have a positive feedback on the release of LH, meaning that the concentration of LH in people with PCOS is always higher. So doing the mathematics, you always find out that because this is low and this is high, the ratio will always be less than 1. Now the luteinizing hormone is responsible for steroid production. So 1, people with PCOS have higher levels of luteinizing hormone, then they have lower levels of FSH, and then higher levels of estrogen. Another function of this luteinizing hormone is that it is able to help production of testosterone in females. Now, the main hormone in females is estrogen. So this testosterone produced by the luteinizing hormone is converted to estrogen. So this estrogen produced from testosterone, in addition to the estrogens produced by fat cells, increases the levels of estrogen in a female with PCOS. Like I said, for you to be able to understand the role of estrogen and these hormones in PCOS, please visit my video on the menstrual cycle. So wrapping up, we have seen PCOS, the full meaning of PCOS, that's Polycystic Ovarian Syndrome, which means that there are lots of cysts in the ovaries. And then because of this condition, you are at risk of getting other conditions too, which is the syndrome. And then we've looked at the hypothalamus, the pituitary gland, and then the ovaries. That's the hypothalamus is responsible for the release of the gonadotropin releasing hormone, which stimulates the anterior parts of the pituitary gland to produce a female follicle stimulating hormone, and then the luteinizing hormone. Now these hormones act on different sides of the ovary to give their effects. So when we talk about the various functions of the FSH, like the main dominant female hormone is also responsible for follicle or the egg development, and then it's also responsible for estrogen production. So FSH acts on the ovaries to produce estrogens in a normal female. But in PCOS, we realize that one risk factor for PCOS was obesity. And these fat cells in people who are obese also produce estrogens. So these high levels of estrogens inhibit the release of follicle-stimulating hormone. And once this hormone has been reduced, the estrogen production from ovaries also goes down. We also looked at the luteinizing hormone, and then we said it's the main hormone responsible for matured egg release from the ovaries. And then in PCOS, the higher levels of estrogens actually have a positive feedback on luteinizing hormone release. So people with PCOS have higher levels of LH. And then we did a simple math saying that FSH LH ratio will always be less than 1 because people with PCOS have low levels of FSH and they have higher levels of LH. We also looked at LH being responsible for the production of testosterone. Now, because females, the main hormone in a female is estrogen, these testosterones are converted into estrogens. And then these estrogens add up to the estrogens produced by the fat cells, increasing the concentration of estrogens in the female with PCOS. And this also goes a long way to inhibit the production of FSH. So patients or people with PCOS have a hormonal imbalance or distort. Now, one way to treat PCOS, as we have seen from this lecture, is mainly by reducing weight or probably reducing obesity if you are obese, checking your diets, exercise, and then a whole lot of other factors. So weight gain or obesity is one main risk factor for PCOS. In my next lecture, we'll explain the symptoms of PCOS, why people with PCOS keep on increasing weight, and then why they have light flows, and then a host of others. Stay tuned.